What can go wrong will go wrong. Murphy. Chapter 2. If something doesn't feel right, check it.
I'm wondering if you'd go wandering with me through the wilderness and woods to where the winds are blowing free, through the darkness of the night, heading toward the morning light. I wonder if you'd wander with me.
After hiking 165 miles, I arrived at Fontana Dam, the gateway to the Smoky Mountains. Soon I'm walking across the dam and up the path to the southern entrance of the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. I've written about that first ascent, climbing up from Fontana Dam to the top of Doe Knob. The first stopping place in the Smoky Mountains was Birch Spring Tent Site. It's the only tent site in the Smokies. All of the other overnight spots are shelters. Birch Spring was a warning of things to come. The tent site is marked with a familiar wooden sign identifying the wayside stop. A side trail led down into a hollow where tents were everywhere. And there's a pretty little stream that flows through the midst of the area. Cables had been installed to aid hikers in hanging their food bags. I'd left my pack up by the trail where there was a couple of flat tent sites. And after surveying the possibilities down among the other hikers, I decided to pitch my tent up by the main trail. It was a good decision. The hum of the hiking crowd was muffled by the elevation where I'd carved out a settlement for the night. So after a restful sleep, I struck camp early and started up the trail, checking my phone app this time to be sure I was going north. And I enjoyed the path lit by the light beam coming from my headlamp. There was rustling of squirrels and other small animals. I was a little more attentive to the sounds in case of a larger animal that might be foraging for an early breakfast. Black bears are usually timid, but this was early in the year and a bear would likely be very hungry after his long winter nap. So I began talking to all of creation, singing to the trees, making noise to let all things know that I was coming up the trail. And soon the birds were singing and the sky began to open up with its beautiful colors. And the lovely day unfolded before me. Hiking up the first big climb of the day wasn't so bad when I couldn't see it. Soon the sun chased away the darkness and the trees opened to display the mountains and valleys that I was walking through. A perfect place for breakfast. And while sitting there and enjoying the view, a couple of folks walked by and commented on the great spot that I discovered. I invited them to join me, but they were in a hurry to get up the trail. Part of me was thankful for the solitude, but part of me was a little sad when they didn't want to take time and soak in this gift of the trail. So many beautiful views rewarded me as I walked along the trail. And I began to realize, surprised by the realization that I was completing the ascents without constantly stopping to catch my breath. Either the ups and downs were getting smaller or I was growing stronger, and perhaps it was a little bit of both. The hikes were more enjoyable, and there were times when I was nearly alone, just the trail and me. The days were rewarding, but something kept stirring inside my soul. Something just didn't feel right. The stirring grew stronger throughout the last 3 nights of the Smokies. I stayed at Icewater Gap Shelter, Tri-Corner Knob Shelter, and at a fire tower on the top of Mount Camera. Each place offered its own twist of this lesson of feelings. Each opened a different perspective of a common theme. Each gave me what I needed to consider why I was out here and how to take the greatest advantage of what the trail offered. Icewater Springs was true to its name. I'd hiked nearly 11 miles in the rain from Klingman's Dome to the shelter. I was cold and soaked. The weather turned from bad to foul in the last quarter mile before arriving at my home for the night. Temperatures dropped and the rain began to freeze. Hail about the size of golf balls began to pelt me. As I hurried to the shelter, I confess that it was sort of fun in a sadistic way. These were the things that make great stories for family and friends. Finally, I arrived at the shelter and rushed into the open-faced structure to meet about 30 of my newest best friends. Many of the shelters in the Smokies were built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s. They're constructed from stone. They have 3 walls with an open front to the elements and a fireplace against one of the side walls. A roof hangs over the open front to provide a cover for the little area where there's counter-style tables and benches, and they offer a place to eat. On this day, cold and wet hikers were crammed together in every place where we could escape the rain. And there was a young couple. Spectrum was his trail name, and I think his wife's name was Sarah. And they kept a fire going. They gathered wood, stripped the wet bark off of it, and fed the flames. So it felt so good to be in the shelter. Hospitality was on full display at Icewater Springs Shelter. Folks shared stories of their day and listened to new experiences. They passed around whatever they had, sharing their food, drink, and other vices that I declined to imbibe in. They squeezed together tightly to offer space to anyone who wanted to sleep in the shelter. But my introverted self was rattling with its desire to escape to the quiet of my tent. And after 4 or 5 hours, the rain stopped long enough for me to jump out and to set up my tent. Inside the tent, I changed into dry clothes. The wool leggings, shirt, socks, and hooded fleece pullover felt wonderful. I slipped into my warm sleeping bag and quickly fell asleep. The background noises of laughter and storytelling didn't disturb me at all. But what did interrupt my slumber was the slope of the ground. There were no level places in the area, so I slid to the left all night long and woke up with my body wrapped around a trekking pole used to hold up that side of the tent. And I feared knocking down the pole and causing the tent to collapse on me in the night. So I would carefully unwrap myself from the pole, crawl back up on the air mattress, and drift off to sleep again. An hour later, I woke to discover the same dilemma with the pole buried deep into my side. I was thankful when the birds began to call me back to the trail for another day of hiking. The trail welcomed me with its familiar rocky ups and downs. The downs were just as challenging as the ups, and inside I complained about the challenges of the Smokies and thought how good it would be to look at this area in my rearview mirror. And just as I was complaining, the trees parted and opened, and a beautiful vista of the layers and upon layers of mountains with sun casting shadows from puffy clouds down into the valleys. There were streams and lakes and farms, small towns that were visible for miles away. Oh, how I would miss seeing these beautiful views. And I realized that I would miss the Smoky Mountains. They demanded a toll to pass through, but the rewards were worth far more than the price. One of the great rewards was Charlie's Bunion. Here's an outcropping of boulders that were nested on the mountainside, and from here was an unobstructed view of the ranges. Mountain peaks reached upward toward the blue sky filled with layers of clouds. Spring was coming, and the trees were changing from winter brown to a bright green. And in the distance, the bluish mountains were blended with the blues of the sky, as if they melted together. Words fail to convey how beautiful it all was. There is a tranquility absorbed into my soul like a long, cold drink of water from the streams along the trail. In contrast to the solitude of the trail, the crowds of the shelter areas were jarring in the evenings. Tri-Corner Shelter was my stop for that night. And after 12 miles of hiking, I was tired and ready to eat dinner, set up my tent and sleep. But the sounds from the shelter area were early warnings of the congestion that lay ahead. Tents were being set up along the trail before the side path that leads to the shelter itself. And I walked down the path and tents were scattered everywhere. I was surprised when one young lady called, "Monk, you're here. Just go to the shelter. It's full, but they'll make room for you." I didn't recognize her, but she knew me. And that was the hospitality and generosity of the trail. The next day I got up, found my breakfast spot along the trail, sat down to eat, and a ridge runner, who is a person who brings news out to hikers as we walk, stopped by to tell me that the Cosby Knob shelter had been closed due to aggressive bear activity. Apparently, a hiker had decided to keep his food in his tent with him, and a bear thought that that was a invitation for him to come in and join him for dinner. The tent was destroyed. Now, I don't know if the destruction was caused by the hiker's quick exit or by the bear's entrance, but the food bag was taken. It's never a good idea to sleep with a food bag in bear country. If something doesn't feel right, check it, because it may be wrong. My goal for that day was Davenport Gap Shelter. It was about 15 miles from where I'd spent the night. But faced with this strong possibility now, with one shelter closed, that Davenport Gap would be even more crowded, I began to look for options. Gunhook app is a valuable tool for hikers. Using GPS, I can see where I'm at on the trail. It also shows many other details, including shelters and water sources, sites of interest along the way. I discovered Mount Camera Fire Tower as a recommended site about a mile off the Appalachian Trail. This promised to be the option that I needed. As I walked down the path, I met a few day hikers who said that it was a lovely site. This trail soon disappeared into a pile of boulders, and I assumed that my destination was over those rocks. As I climbed up, there was a glimpse of a white two-story round building, and finally ascending the steps of the fire tower, I had found my home for the night. The door was propped open. Several window panes were missing and covered with fabric and sheets of metal that flapped and popped in the strong winds on top of Mount Camera. On my final night in the Smokies, they had truly saved the best for last. The views were indescribable. A 360-degree view of tree-covered mountains extended outward as far as I could see. Looking down in the valleys, there were little communities, farmsteads, lakes, and creeks. The sunset was a precious gift. As the darkness covered the land, the wind grew still and all was at peace. This was the experience that I'd craved. I was so thankful for the contrast and realized that sometimes we need to see what looks right in order to discern the cause of what feels wrong. The following morning was like an exclamation mark punctuating this lesson the Smokies was teaching me. Before the sunrise, the valleys were scattered with lights from homes that were previously hidden by the canopies of trees. It looked like Christmas lights sparkling on the largest of trees. The sun came out from its hiding place. As I've described when hiking before dawn, the darkness begins a subtle change of shades. Purple and blue hues just hint of things to come. Then pinks, yellows, oranges, and reds burst from the horizon into the sky and chase away the darkness. This was on full display here on this fire tower. It was as if God was saying, "You think you've seen wondrous things? You ain't seen nothing yet." Retracing my way back over the rocks and boulders to a smoother path that led about a mile to the trail, I started north once again. It was a beautiful day. The past 3 days had been lovely. After a couple of easy miles, the sign to the Davenport Gap shelter marked yesterday's original goal. I turned and walked to see what I had missed. It was a lovely shelter, much like the others where I'd stayed on this journey. 2 floor decks inside could comfortably accommodate 12 weary hikers. Probably 20 or 30 had been there last night. The fireplace was still smoldering, so I got water from the nearby stream and drowned the remaining embers. The surrounding terrain offered no flat spots for tents. It would have been an uncomfortable night, and I was thankful that I had stayed on Mount Cameron. The small black box labeled permits marked the northern terminus of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and at mile 238.9, I had made it to the end of the Smokies. I hoped to walk 2 more miles to the parking lot and call for a shuttle. I was excited. And walking on, I began to hear voices. No, it wasn't an indication of a mental breakdown. The trail echoes voices and sounds for miles, it seems. These voices began to sound familiar. 2 children were running down the path, and they were leading 2 dogs, and in the back was Pat. Pat is a good friend who lives in western North Carolina, and he had monitored my progress along the trail by watching the Garmin mini satellite tracker that I wear on these long hikes. The Garmin makes it possible for me to send text messages to my family when I have no phone signal, and it connects to a website plotting out my location on a map. Pat had been watching and planning to meet me as I came out of the Smoky Mountains, and here he stood. Later, Pat would drop me at a hotel, and I took a day of rest to reflect on my experiences over the past 240 miles on the trail. I was able to consider what compelled me to be out here. I could partially answer the question of why this is important to me. First, the trail allowed me to unplug from the responsibilities at home. At least I could mostly unplug, but my mind often drifted back to family needs. But the unplugging gave me an opportunity to have conversations with myself. I realized that my life had been dedicated to serving others, military, ministry, and family. I served because that was who I am. However, I also served because I feared what others thought of me. One way feels right, the other feels wrong. Serving others because that's the heart that I have been given is fulfilling and satisfying. There's a word for someone or something that fulfills the purpose that they were designed to fulfill. The Greek word is doxa. It translates into English as glory. And on the flip side, it's draining and depressing when I serve from a feeling of obligation or a concern of being judged by others. And I realize that it's easy for me to slip from the healthy place of fulfilling my life purpose into being concerned about what others think about me. The healthy side embraces who I am. The unhealthy side strives to live up to someone else's expectations. Glory is healthy. Judgment of others is not. The trail had shown me the difference. I considered the broader question about why I was hiking in the first place. If I was doing this to prove something to others, then I needed to just stop. Such motivations would only lead to disappointment and emotional injury. If I was hiking for the reasons I told myself and others, then this was a journey for personal enlightenment, and that was a worthy cause. I concluded that there were mixed motives that compels me to hike. One motive is to prove something to others. However, that's a minor ambition. My primary goal is to spend time with myself, getting to know me, and discovering if I like the person that I see in the mirror. As I consider that as my real goal, then I considered the possibility of reaching that goal while hiking the way that I have been hiking throughout the Smokies. Something didn't feel right. I had to check it to discover the problem. Now I needed a plan to fix it.
I'm wondering if you'd come wandering my way. If you ever get lost, or if the trail leads you astray, the music of the pack can always bring you back. I wonder, can we wander away? And I'll spread the word, and you beat the drum. Round up the troops and get the gang